Coming back to the statistics you mentioned in your opening, you suggested that these involve very complicated calculations, but why is there so little correlation between the amount we throw at something and the results we see? Longevity, quality of life. I mean, why is that?
So the biggest driver is inequalities. So basically, if you come from Glasgow, if you live in one part of Glasgow and you're a man, you're going to live 15 years longer than in another part of Glasgow in neighbourhoods that are very close to one another, irrespective of your experience of healthcare. Although even then, you might be less likely to be diagnosed early with cancer or get the treatment you need if you can't argue your case or don't have relatives who can do that for you. So these things are all intertwined. So those are actually the biggest determinants of life expectancy in developed countries. The exception is if you live in an environment where you don't have access to basic public health and healthcare, of course your life expectancy is affected. So no matter how much money we spend on healthcare in the UK, unless we can improve people's lives, we're actually just flushing it down the toilet because the demand will always be there.
Yeah, and also I think completely agree, but also there are there are less tangible things. So, for example, we know that loneliness versus being part of communities and being connected with other people is really deleterious to longevity. And Linda, you mentioned about access to healthcare. If you're brought up in fortunate circumstances with parents and teachers who really believe in you, you have lots of opportunities, you take them, you get them, you feel much more empowered and confident, and you're much more likely to, when you're not being offered health care or you're being fobbed off in some way, or you don't want to bother these busy doctors, etc. You're less likely to access the kind of care that would be helpful to you in the long run.
So you're saying that upbringing is crucial, or you're brought up to
upbringing, and also the communities in which you live in, the kind of subtle messages in society that make you feel confident, I can be anyone, I can do anything, or the kind of experience in society where people get knockbacks, often through no fault of their own. Look at what happened over the last couple of years. Some people happened to be in the wrong jobs and, had a bad time. So, what really is needed is a society and as a government who has this overarching kind of view about human beings, the conditions they live in, what people's needs are, and that drives things going forward.
That's a fascinating phrase, the subtle messages we give to society. I mean, you guys are in this business. I mean, what are these subtle messages that we need to give more of, or as it were, put into the minds of our children and our news media and our governments, most important?
Well, the most important thing we can give children is love. I mean, in the work that we're doing in Scotland, we have something called The Promise, which is children who have been in the care system or at risk of the care system. So their life chances, both their health and their well-being, are dramatically affected by not being loved in the same way as others. So I think giving people support, love, and then moving on, giving people good information remains important, but having the confidence, as Susan says, to interact. So these are soft things that we can do, and people who are trained in mental health engage with people, and that's why you were talking about counselling therapies. They're looking for the listening and also the tools to think about how they engage with others. So those are things which do cost money, but they're not as expensive as some of the other things.
And in addition to love, I think another thing that, again, studies show this, is something called self-efficacy. So sorry about the jargon, but it's basically showing that people can make a difference to the world around them, feeling efficacious. And what's been shown to happen, if you could improve people's feeling of empowerment, I suppose, that predicts, getting jobs, the amount of money you earn, lots of things, much more than other more kind of objective measures. So in addition to giving love, I think really encouraging children and adolescents and adults to really think that what they can do can make a difference. But you do have to have a society around you where that's true of.
Yeah. Can I pick up on that point? Because that's an important one. And I think the caveat at the end was really important, Susan. I agree with that, because we want to avoid phony empowerment as well. The idea that if you just work hard enough and you believe in yourself hard enough, things will turn out good for you in the end. And I think the lifestyle mantra falls into this trap to some extent. It's change your lifestyle and things will get better. Well, what's that saying to someone? The onus is on you to change your predicament. But what happens if you're a single mum living in a council estate, you've got 3 kids, living in a council estate in South London, you're struggling, you're stressed, you're not going to be able to change your lifestyle. It's hard to change your lifestyle when you're living in poverty, in social deprivation, you're suffering from discrimination. And I think as a society, we shouldn't be selling the illusion that self-empowerment is enough. It's not enough. We need we need mentally healthy social policy. We need political critique of the policies that are generating poor mental health and physical health in the population. And we shouldn't acquit our government of the responsibility for addressing those issues by locating the cause of the problem in self-empowerment and self-change and self-reform.
So I'm going to go back to overweight and obesity. We've just come out of a pandemic, and our Prime Minister, who discovered that carrying extra weight might have been a factor for him in his COVID outcomes, was committed to doing something about childhood obesity. And I told you about the politicians only thinking about the short term. One of the things we could do about that is actually not blame kids for becoming overweight or obese, not blame their parents for not cooking them healthy meals that they can't afford, but actually do something about where our food is coming from, what's in our food, what's cheap, what's expensive, and the marketing of that food. And certainly at the Westminster level, they've pressed pause on those childhood obesity policies for at least another year, which in my mind is really madness.
So you're saying that the government has sat on this question of advertising and unhealthy food for children?
Yeah, they absolutely are sitting on it. And the reason they're sitting on it, they're arguing that one of it is the cost of living, which is a crisis, the cost of living crisis, we know that. But the main reason for that is lobbying. It's industry lobbying. Of course, the food industry doesn't want you to restrict the advertising they can do on children's programs or on the internet. No, absolutely. They want to make as much money as they can from people eating products which are not beneficial for our health. And that's just the reality. And you'd be hard-pressed to find many people who would disagree with that as the main reason.
Yeah. And I think I completely agree, James, this whole mantra of personal responsibility is really, really dangerous, because it's as if, the government, the people we pay taxes to, haven't got responsibility. And I think one really stark example is children's classrooms. It would have cost really so little in the scheme of things to have got decent ventilation in children's classrooms and kept them safe. It's never been done. And it's not enough to say, well, teachers, it's your responsibility, or, children, it's your responsibility. So I think at the end of the day, if we want to change things, and if we want to ensure that there's better health and well-being, then actually I think, and again, this is being political, maybe, I don't know, we need collective action. If we look, why do we have the things that we have today? Why do we have the health service we have, the education, etc., etc.? It's because people came together and demanded it, and collective action to actually get things going. I mean, remember the free school meals? There was campaigning for that. So I think that's what we need to do going forward. But that does empower people. It's a two-way thing. If you're together collectively, you feel more empowered to make a difference than if you're just accepting the rhetoric, well, it's up to your personal responsibility, individual choice, which I think is really unhelpful.
James, I can't help but remember that the words modern capitalism appear in the subtitle of your book. I mean, have you got to take a financial, perhaps, or political financial take on this? Making us run away from the bigger picture of the need for love, housing, self-efficacy, food, classrooms. I mean, is capitalism the dark hand behind all this?
Well, one of the arguments I advance is that the reason why the mental health sector has broadly, in my view, failed since the 1980s is because ultimately it's developed as a social institution to serve late capitalism rather than individuals who are in need. And that's the fundamental error at the heart of the system. But picking up on the point about where do we locate the cause of distress, I think our mental health sector, broadly speaking, has a lot to answer for, because I think we've sold a model to the population over the last few decades that the cause of your problem resides in you. It's an internal dysfunction, right? You've got a chemical imbalance possibly. By the way, that's a myth. It's never been demonstrated that chemical imbalance caused depression. But anyway, that's a myth that was sold by the pharmaceutical industry, because if you've got a chemical imbalance and the drugs correct the balance, then you should take the drugs. So it's a very popular myth. It got SSRIs off the ground, but it's not been demonstrated. Or you've got a cognitive dysfunction in between your ears somewhere that needs to be resolved. The problem is, when you work on the ground with people, you quickly learn that the vast majority of people's distress is a protest. Suffering is often, in the emotional realm, a protest against inhospitable and bad conditions. It's a call to change. It's a signal that things in your world aren't working. It could be your relationships, it could be your family life, it could be your wider environment, it could be the unjust social structures to which you're subject, inequality, etc., and so forth. And I think going forward, the mental health sector, if it has any hope of reversing this, I think, dire trend in outcomes, it has to start acknowledging that a lot of the suffering we all experience isn't rooted here, it's rooted out there. And
but
so we need to be focusing our interventions out there.
It's an interaction. You know, it's not one or the other, it's an interaction. You can have the same people in the same adverse circumstances, and one does okay and the other completely collapses. So I really think that you have to have a model to understand people in relation to the environment around them. The other thing is, I also think there's an interaction between sometimes medicines and the help one gets from medicines and one's ability to change things in the world around to improve things. So I worked for many, many years as a clinical psychologist, and I saw many, many people who were profoundly depressed. And yes, some of them had had very adverse experiences, but whether or not they had or hadn't, they were in a situation where they weren't in any situation to be able to begin to help themselves and to change things around and to have those conversations and to pick up the phone and all those other things. And for many people, medication can make the difference between them being completely helpless and passive and actually having enough sort of resilience and mental strength to be able to do what's needed to help themselves in the long run. And then they can come off them. So, you know, I think they do have a role. I would not be anti-medicines. I think for mental health as well as physical health, I think medicines have a role. But I also agree, like Linda said about vested interests, the pharmaceutical industry, especially in the States, and it's creeping in here, all of this should be nationalised. It shouldn't be people who are going to make private profit by making you think that you've got this illness and therefore you need that drug. That's what the problem is, I think.
And not just big pharma. I mean, the insurance companies in the States are a huge, I understand, suffocator. But all three of you seem to be saying something, I think I discern a pattern here of, it's the bigger picture we have to get to. All of these things, biological, psychological, social, spiritual. How can you guys get the government, you've got their ears after all, to see the bigger picture in their policies?
I think you do it step by step. I think we've done it with smoking. If you imagine in the 1950s and 60s, we had 80% of men who smoked in the UK. We exported manufactured cigarettes to the world. And now we have the second lowest rates of smoking in Europe. But it took 50 years for the recommendations from the Royal College of Physicians, smoking and health, to be implemented. So I think with some of these other changes that we need to make, whether it's a better approach to mental health, dealing with some of these preventable risk factors, we have to take it step by step, because governments rarely make big changes. The other thing is, two final points. We have to still stay standing. So even if you have an unpopular opinion, keep saying it if there's good evidence behind it. And then also just train, I think, healthcare professionals, clinicians of a whole variety of degrees to become political, because they actually see the case for prevention and they see the case for thinking about people's environments, but they're on the same track of promotion, thinking about the fact that people want a prescription or need a prescription. What is their area of expertise, and they shouldn't stray out of it. So be political. If you've got a belief that's evidence-based, keep shouting about it and wait for your opportunity to make change, because I'm still hopeful that it will come along.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.